The champagne glass felt cold against my palm as I watched my sister Madison accept the ring me ring from the man I'd spent 3 years believing would be my husband. The crystalline clarity of that moment cut through every excuse I'd made for him, every rationalization I'd whispered to myself in the dark. As Derek slipped the vintage Art Deco diamond onto Madison's finger, the same finger where it had once promised me forever, I felt something inside me shift with the mechanical precision of a lock clicking shut. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply set down my glass, excused myself from the impromptu engagement party that had erupted in my parents' living room, and walked upstairs to my childhood bedroom with the measured steps of someone who had finally, definitively, seen enough. The ring had been my grandmother's, not Derek's family heirloom, not some piece he'd saved months to afford mine. Eleanor Whitmore had worn it for 63 years of marriage to my grandfather, through the Depression, 2 wars, and 8 children. When she died, she left it specifically to me, her eldest granddaughter, with the handwritten note that still lived in my jewelry box. For Catherine, who has always known the value of loyalty. May you find someone worthy of yours. I should have remembered those words when Derek first started making comments about the ring 2 years into our relationship. It was too old-fashioned, he said, too small. Too much like something a grandmother would wear, which of course, it was. When we started talking about marriage, he suggested we trade it in for something more modern, more us. When I gently explained its significance, he'd nodded with the practiced understanding of someone who had no intention of respecting what I'd just said, but knew the right facial expression to make. Of course, babe, I get it. Family stuff is important. Derek had a gift for that, saying the words that should have meant understanding while his eyes calculated how long he'd need to wait before bringing it up again. 3 months later, he suggested I keep it as a right-hand ring after we got engaged. 6 months after that, he wondered aloud if maybe I was being a little sentimental about a piece of jewelry. A year later, he was openly frustrated that I was holding on to the past instead of embracing our future together. I should have seen the pattern then. Derek approached obstacles the way water approaches a dam, constant, patient pressure until something gave way. He'd done it with my Friday night dinners with my college friends. We hardly get any couple time. My volunteer work at the animal shelter. Wouldn't Saturday mornings be better spent together? And my tradition of calling my grandmother every Sunday before she died. We're building our own traditions now. Each concession felt reasonable in isolation. Each compromise was wrapped in the language of love and togetherness. It wasn't until I was standing in my parents' living room, watching him slide my grandmother's ring onto my sister's finger, that I understood Derek didn't make compromises. He made strategic advances. Every mutual decision we'd reached had somehow aligned perfectly with what Derek had wanted from the beginning. The ring disappearance had been gradual, too. Last month, Derek had suggested I store it somewhere safe while we figured out our timeline. He was starting his MBA program, he'd explained, and engagement rings were expensive. Why rush into that kind of financial commitment when we were already committed to each other? It made sense to wait until after graduation, until his career was more stable, until we could afford the kind of wedding we both deserved. I'd reluctantly agreed, touched by what seemed like his practical consideration for our future. I'd put the ring in my safety deposit box, telling myself that 2 more years wasn't so long to wait for a man I'd already invested 3 years in. I'd focused on being supportive of his new academic demands, understanding when he needed space to study, patient when he grew distant and stressed. What I hadn't realized was that Derek had a key to my safety deposit box, something I'd given him the year before, during a brief health scare when I'd wanted someone to have access to my important documents. I'd forgotten about it completely until the bank called 3 weeks ago to inform me that someone had accessed my box. They'd assumed it was me, of course. Who else would have a key? When I'd rushed to the bank and found the ring missing, I'd called Derek in a panic. Had there been a break-in? Should we call the police? Derek's voice had carried just the right note of concern and confusion. He'd meet me at the bank immediately, he'd said. We'd figure this out together. But Derek never came to the bank. Instead, he called an hour later with apologies. A family emergency had come up. His grandmother had fallen, and he was driving to the hospital. Could we deal with the ring situation tomorrow? Of course I'd said yes. Family came first. I'd spent the evening worrying about a woman I'd never met, checking my phone for updates, preparing to be the supportive girlfriend who understood that sometimes life interrupted plans. The family emergency had stretched into a week-long visit with relatives in another state. Derek had been so sorry, but his grandmother was fragile, and the family needed him. He'd make it up to me when he got back. We'd file a police report, call the insurance company, do whatever needed to be done. Except Derek hadn't been in another state. My sister Madison had told me herself casually over dinner just 3 nights ago. She'd seen him at the coffee shop downtown, the one near the university campus. She'd waved, but he'd seemed not to notice her. She'd thought it was odd that he was back in town when I'd told everyone he was visiting sick family. I'd made excuses for him then. Maybe he'd driven back for supplies, or maybe Madison had been mistaken. Derek wouldn't lie to me, not about something like this. We'd been together for 3 years. We were planning a future together. People in love didn't deceive each other with such calculated precision. But tonight, watching him propose to my sister with my grandmother's ring, I finally understood the scope of Derek's planning. This hadn't been an impulse decision or a moment of weakness. This had been a campaign. Madison was everything Derek had always suggested I should be more like. 2 years younger, she was in law school, a more prestigious program than my master's in social work. She was taller, blonde where I was brunette, effortlessly social where I was thoughtfully quiet. When Derek and I attended family gatherings, I'd watch him light up around Madison in ways that should have concerned me more than they did. He'd hang on her stories about law school, ask detailed questions about her cases, remember the names of her professors and friends. With me, conversations about my work helping homeless teenagers often felt perfunctory, something to get through before moving to topics that actually interested him. Madison had been single for 6 months, ever since her breakup with the investment banker she'd dated through most of law school. She'd been vulnerable, lonely, eager to meet someone new. And Derek had been there, suddenly single himself after our mutual decision to take a break. I'd believed that narrative too. The story Derek had told me just 1 week ago about needing space to focus on school, about how much pressure he'd been feeling about our future, about how maybe we should take some time apart to make sure we were really right for each other. He'd been so careful to frame it as temporary, a pause rather than an ending. We'd talked about staying friends, about checking in with each other, about seeing how we both felt after some time to think. I'd spent the week analyzing our relationship, wondering what I'd done wrong, making mental lists of ways I could be more supportive when we got back together. Derek apparently had spent the week courting my sister. Now I understood why he'd been so insistent about getting the ring before our break, why he'd seemed so concerned about its safety, so thoughtful about protecting something that meant so much to me. He'd needed it to be secure, all right secure in his possession, ready for the proposal he'd already been planning. The most sickening part was how perfectly he'd calculated it all. Madison adored the ring, as Derek had known she would. She'd always complimented it when she'd seen it on my hand, asking about its history, admiring its vintage details. And our family loved Derek, as he'd also known they would. He'd spent 3 years charming my parents, remembering birthdays, showing up to family dinners with thoughtful wine selections, and genuine interest in my father's golf stories. Derek had made himself indispensable to my family before making himself unnecessary to me. Standing in my childhood bedroom now, I could hear the celebration continuing downstairs. My mother's delighted laughter, my father opening another bottle of champagne. Madison's friends arriving to see the ring, their excited squeals echoing through the house. The sound of Derek accepting congratulations, playing the role of the devoted fiancé with the same skill he'd used to play the role of my devoted boyfriend. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't making excuses for Derek's behavior. I wasn't searching for explanations that would preserve my faith in his character. I wasn't twisting myself into shapes that would accommodate his version of reality. Instead, I was thinking about my grandmother's note, about loyalty and finding someone worthy of it, about the difference between love and possession, between commitment and ownership. Derek had taken my ring, but more than that, he'd taken my trust, my time, and my family's affection under false pretenses. He'd built his future happiness on the foundation of my discarded dreams, and he'd done it with the methodical patience of someone who'd been planning this betrayal from the beginning. But Derek had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that because I'd been patient with his demands, accommodating of his needs, and forgiving of his flaws, I was weak. He'd confused my capacity for love with an inability to recognize when that love was being weaponized against me. The ring was legally mine. My grandmother had left it to me, not to any future husband, not to any man who might one day propose with it. Derek had stolen it, plain and simple, and the fact that he'd done so with calculated charm rather than obvious force didn't change the fundamental nature of the theft. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. Derek was meticulous about documentation, a habit from his business background that had always impressed me. He'd taught me to keep records of important conversations, to save receipts, to maintain clear paper trails. For once, his lessons were going to work against him. I began typing a timeline of the ring's disappearance. Every conversation we'd had about it, every excuse he'd made. The bank records would show when the safety deposit box had been accessed. The timing would align perfectly with Derek's supposed family emergency, and I had Madison's testimony that he'd been in town when he'd claimed to be visiting relatives. I wasn't going to cry, and I wasn't going to confront him tonight in front of my family. That would be exactly what Derek would expect from me, emotional, reactive, easily dismissed. Instead, I was going to do something Derek had never seen me do before. I was going to plan. Derek thought he knew me. He thought he'd categorized me as someone who would accept whatever narrative he constructed, someone who would prioritize family harmony over personal justice, someone who would rather suffer in silence than cause a scene. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. The next morning, I started with my parents, not with accusations or drama, but with simple questions about estate law and jewelry inheritance. My mother, still glowing from Madison's engagement news, was happy to reminisce about my grandmother and the ring she'd left me. She was so specific about that in her will, Mom said, flipping through old photo albums over coffee. She wanted you to have it because you reminded her of herself at that age. Thoughtful, loyal, family-oriented. She said you'd treasure it properly. The will specifically mentioned me by name? I asked, pulling out my phone to record the conversation with Mom's permission. Oh yes, absolutely. She left specific jewelry to each of the granddaughters, but the engagement ring was explicitly yours. She even included that sweet note about finding someone worthy of your loyalty. Mom paused, looking concerned. Why do you ask, honey? Is everything okay with Derek? I know you two were taking some time apart, but last night seemed like such a lovely surprise. I'd been preparing for this conversation since I'd woken up, rehearsing the right balance of information and restraint. I'm just trying to understand some legal questions about inherited jewelry. Did Derek ever mention to you or Dad that he had concerns about the ring's security? Security? Mom's eyebrows rose. No, never, although… She paused, clearly accessing a memory. Now that you mention it, when he was talking to your father about proposing this was months ago, before you two decided to take a break, he did ask about family expectations regarding heirloom rings. Whether you'd be hurt if he chose something new instead? The coffee cup felt steady in my hands despite the significance of what Mom had just revealed. He asked Dad about proposing to me? When was this? Oh, it must have been 4 or 5 months ago. He was so thoughtful about it, asking about your ring specifically, whether it would hurt your feelings if he proposed with something different. Your father told him that ring meant everything to you, that you'd worn it on your right hand since grandmother's funeral. Mom smiled fondly. Derek seemed to really take that to heart. He asked lots of questions about its history, its value, how long you'd had it. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral while adding this information to my mental timeline. 4 or 5 months ago, Derek had still been my boyfriend, still been planning our future together. But he'd also been researching the ring with the kind of thoroughness he usually reserved for business presentations. Did he ever ask about Madison during these conversations? I asked carefully. Mom's smile faltered slightly. About Madison? Why would he? Oh, the realization was dawning on her face. Catherine, are you suggesting that Derek's proposal to Madison wasn't as spontaneous as it seemed? I reached across the table and took her hand. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully about your answer. When Derek proposed to Madison last night, What exactly did he say about the ring? Mom was quiet for a long moment, her excitement from the previous evening giving way to something more complicated. He said it was a family ring, that it had been his grandmother's, and he'd been saving it for the right person. Madison was so touched by the story. The mechanical clicking sound happened in my chest again, another piece of Derek's deception falling precisely into place. Did Madison recognize the ring at all? Well, yes, of course. She commented on how similar it looked to yours, how it must run in his family to have such classic taste. Mom's voice was growing quieter. Catherine, what are you telling me? I showed her the photo on my phone in the ring on my hand from just 2 months ago at my cousin's wedding. Then I showed her the close-up I'd taken of it on Madison's hand last night, after she'd fallen asleep on the couch and before Derek had driven her home. They were identical, down to the tiny chip on the setting that had happened when I'd knocked it against a countertop last year. Mom stared at the photos for a long time. When she looked up, her face had transformed from confused to genuinely angry, an expression I'd rarely seen from my diplomatically minded mother. He stole your ring, she said flatly. And he lied to Madison about where it came from. I think so, yes. What are you going to do? It was the question I'd been asking myself since I'd woken up. The question that had led me to carefully document everything Derek had said about the ring, to research the legal implications of inheritance theft, to consider my options with the cold calculation Derek himself had taught me. I'm going to get it back, I said. And then I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man Derek really is. Mom nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Her immediate support meant more than I could express. I'd been prepared to convince her, to overcome her desire to maintain family peace, to argue my case against her fondness for Derek. Instead, she was ready to help me fight. I need you to keep acting normal around Madison until I figure out the best way to handle this. She's innocent in all of this. Derek manipulated her just like he manipulated me. And I need you to help me gather some information. What kind of information? I pulled out my notebook, where I'd been organizing my thoughts since dawn. I need to know exactly what Derek told Madison about their relationship timeline. When they first started talking, how long they've been seeing each other, what he told her about me. I also need to know what story he gave her about the ring, every detail he shared about its supposed history. Mom was already reaching for her phone. I'll invite Madison for lunch today. Girl talk about wedding planning, she'll want to share everything. And Mom, don't let on that we've had this conversation. I need Derek to think everything is proceeding normally while I figure out the legalities. Of course. She paused, studying my face. Catherine, I have to scare you. Sure you want to do this? Going after Derek legally, I mean. It's going to be complicated and messy, and it might damage his relationship with Madison. It was a fair question, and I appreciated that she was asking it. My mother had always been protective of family harmony, skilled at finding diplomatic solutions that preserved everyone's dignity. In other circumstances, I might have taken her advice to handle this quietly, privately, with minimal disruption to the family dynamic. But Derek hadn't just stolen an object from me. He'd stolen time, trust, and emotional energy. He'd taken something that represented 4 generations of my family's history and used it to build a lie. He'd made me question my own perceptions, my own worth, my own capacity for love. Most importantly, he was doing to Madison exactly what he'd done to me. He was building their relationship on deception, counting on her trust and my silence to protect him from the consequences of his choices. Madison deserves to know who she's marrying, I said, and Derek deserves to face the consequences of what he's done. I'm not going to protect him from either of those things anymore. Mom smiled, not the diplomatic smile she used to smooth over family conflicts, but the proud smile she'd given me when I'd stood up to playground bullies as a child. Then, let's get your ring back. Madison's lunch conversation with Mom was even more revealing than I'd hoped. By evening, I had a complete timeline of Derek's deception, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Derek and Madison had first connected at a family barbecue 6 months ago while he was still my boyfriend, while we were still living together, while he was still making plans for our supposed future. He'd sought her out on social media the next day, starting with innocent comments on her law school posts and gradually escalating to private messages about career advice. The conversations had moved to text within a month. Derek had been careful to present himself as someone seeking guidance from someone in his field of interest. It mentioned considering law school as a backup plan if his MBA didn't lead where he wanted. Madison, generous and encouraging by nature, had been happy to share her experiences and offer support. By the time Derek and I had taken our break a week ago, he and Madison had been having daily conversations for 2 months. He'd been sharing increasingly personal details about his life, his goals, his disappointment in his current relationship with someone who didn't understand his ambitions. Madison had confided in Mom that she'd been developing feelings for Derek for weeks before he'd officially ended things with me. She'd felt guilty about it, she'd said, but Derek had made it clear that our relationship was essentially over anyway. He'd been staying with a friend because we'd been fighting so much. He'd been unhappy for months but trying to make things work out of loyalty. Every word of it was a lie. Derek and I hadn't been fighting, he hadn't been staying with a friend. He'd been coming home to me every night, making love to me, planning weekend trips, discussing graduate school applications and career moves and 5-year plans. He'd been living a completely double life with a precision that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so devastating. The ring story Madison had shared was even more elaborate than I'd expected. According to Derek, it had belonged to his grandmother Eleanor conveniently, the same name as my actual grandmother. She'd passed away recently, he'd told Madison, and he'd inherited her engagement ring along with some other family pieces. His grandmother had always told him to save it for someone truly special, someone who would appreciate its history and character. Derek had even invented a backstory about his grandmother's marriage, describing a love story that was remarkably similar to the actual story of my grandparents' relationship. He'd borrowed not just the ring, but the entire romantic narrative that came with it, repackaging my family's history as his own. But Derek's most calculating move had been his timing. He'd proposed to Madison at our family gathering, in front of our parents, surrounded by people who already knew and liked him. He'd made it impossible for Madison to say no without causing a scene, and he'd ensured that any future objections from me would seem like jealousy or spite rather than legitimate grievances. Or so he'd thought. That evening I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my lawyer cousin James, who specialized in estate law. The second was to the police, to file a report for theft of inherited property. James confirmed what I'd already researched. The ring was legally mine, regardless of any relationship status with Derek. Taking it without permission, especially through deceptive access to my safety deposit box, constituted theft. The value of the ring, which I'd had appraised at $802 years ago, made it a felony. The police report was straightforward. I had documentation of ownership, proof of Derek's access to my safety deposit box, bank records showing when the box had been accessed, and his own lies about being out of town during the time in question. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic and thorough, explaining that jewelry theft in romantic relationships was more common than people realized. The tricky part, Officer Martinez explained, is that he's already given it to someone else as an engagement ring. Recovery might be complicated if the current holder doesn't want to give it up voluntarily. What if the current holder doesn't know it was stolen? I asked. Then they're an innocent party and we work with them to resolve the situation. Most people are cooperative once they understand the facts. That night, I called Madison. I need to talk to you about Derek, I said without preamble, and I need you to listen to me completely before you respond. There was a pause. Catherine, if this is about jealousy, it's about the ring he proposed to you with. It's mine, Madison. It's been stolen, and I've filed a police report. The silence stretched long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. What do you mean it's yours? Madison's voice was very small. I mean, it belonged to our grandmother Eleanor. She left it to me specifically when she died. Derek took it from my safety deposit box without permission while we were still together, then lied to me about a family emergency to buy time. The ring you're wearing is stolen property. I heard Madison sit down heavily, the distinctive creak of the old chair in her apartment. That's impossible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Derek said it was his grandmother's ring. He told me the whole story about how she met his grandfather, how they were married for over 60 years. He told you our grandparents' story, Madison. He took our family's history along with our family's ring. I walked her through the timeline carefully, sharing the evidence I'd gathered, the conversations I'd recorded with Mom, the documentation I'd assembled. Madison asked sharp questions, sure law school training kicking in even as her personal world collapsed, but she didn't interrupt or argue. She listened with the focused attention of someone who was finally seeing the full picture of something that had never quite made sense. When I finished, Madison was crying. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Catherine, I had no idea. I would never, if I'd known." "You couldn't have known. Derek is an expert at making people trust him, but Madison, I need the ring back. And I think you need to know exactly who you're engaged to before you make any more plans." "Of course. God, of course you need it back. I'll get it from Derek tonight." "No," I said quickly. "Don't confront him yet. I need you to do exactly what I tell you, and I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Madison's voice was steadier when she answered, "Yes. What do you need me to do?" The plan I outlined for Madison was simple but required careful execution. She would act completely normal around Derek for the next 3 days, giving no indication that we'd spoken or that she knew about the ring's true history. Meanwhile, I would finalize the legal paperwork and coordinate with the police for Derek's arrest. On Friday evening, Madison would invite Derek over for dinner. She'd suggest they start planning their wedding in earnest, maybe call some venues, get a timeline together. She'd be enthusiastic and loving, the perfect picture of an excited fiancé. And then, just as Derek was settling into the comfortable certainty of his successful deception, I would arrive. Madison had protested this part of the plan initially. Why not just have the police arrest him? Why the elaborate confrontation? But I'd explained that I needed Derek to have the chance to reveal his true character publicly, with witnesses. I needed Madison to see him react when his carefully constructed lies were exposed. More than that, I needed to face him myself. For 3 years, Derek had controlled every narrative, shaped every conflict, managed every resolution to his advantage. He'd made me doubt my own perceptions, question my own worth, accept less than I deserved because he'd convinced me it was the best I could hope for. I wasn't going to let him be arrested quietly, privately, with his dignity intact and his reputation protected. I was going to make him confront what he'd done, in front of the sister he'd manipulated and the family he'd charmed. Derek was going to face the consequences of his choices, with the same public exposure he'd used to trap Madison into accepting his proposal. The 3 days passed slowly. Madison called me each evening to report on Derek's behavior, her voice growing more disgusted with each conversation. He was already pushing for a quick wedding, she told me. He was worried about the costs of a long engagement, concerned about the stress of wedding planning interfering with both their academic schedules. Better to just go to the courthouse, maybe have a small reception later. Derek was trying to lock Madison in before she had time to think, just as he'd tried to lock me in with promises and future plans and constant pressure to commit to his timeline rather than my own. But Madison was thinking now, with the clarity that comes from finally understanding the scope of someone's deception. She was remembering comments Derek had made about me, seemingly sympathetic observations that she now realized had been calculated to poison her opinion of her own sister. She was recognizing how he'd isolated her from her friends during their courtship, how he'd demanded more and more of her time and attention. Most painfully, she was realizing that every romantic gesture he'd made, every piece of personal information he'd shared, every moment of intimacy they'd experienced had been built on lies. By Friday evening, Madison was ready for the confrontation. Derek arrived at 7 with flowers and wine, playing the role of the devoted fiancé with his usual skill. Madison greeted him with enthusiasm that was only slightly forced, leading him to the kitchen while she finished preparing dinner. I watched from across the street, waiting for Madison's text that Derek was settled and comfortable before making my entrance. At 7:30, my phone buzzed. "He's relaxed and talking about honeymoon plans. Come now." I crossed the street and rang Madison's doorbell. Madison answered with perfect surprise. "Catherine, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to Derek," I said loudly enough for him to hear from the kitchen. "It's about some property of mine that's gone missing." Derek appeared in the doorway, wine glass in hand, his face arranged in an expression of polite confusion. "Hey, Catherine, what's going on? Property?" This was the moment I'd been planning for 3 days, the confrontation I'd been rehearsing since I'd watched him slide my ring onto Madison's finger. But looking at Derek now comfortable in my sister's apartment, drinking wine he'd brought to celebrate their fraudulent engagement, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd successfully manipulated everyone around him. I felt only cold, crystalline clarity. "My grandmother's ring," I said calmly. "The one you stole from my safety deposit box, the one you used to propose to my sister after lying to her about its history." Derek's face went through a series of quick changes: surprise, confusion, calculation, denial. "Catherine, I don't know what you're talking about. What ring?" It was exactly the response I'd expected. Derek's instinct was always to deny first, to buy time while he figured out what I knew and how much damage he could contain. The Art Deco diamond ring that belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, my grandmother, the one she left specifically to me in her will. The one you accessed from my safety deposit box while lying to me about visiting your sick relatives. I kept my voice level, factual. The one Madison is wearing right now. Madison held up her left hand, and I watched Derek's eyes track from the ring to her face to mine. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much we'd discussed, whether he could still salvage the situation. "Madison," he said carefully, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Madison said quietly. "Catherine showed me the inheritance documents. She showed me the photos. She explained how you got access to her safety deposit box." Derek's expression shifted to the wounded confusion he'd perfected over 3 years of relationship conflicts. "Catherine, I can't believe you'd try to sabotage your sister's happiness like this. I know you're upset about our breakup, but this is—" "Derek," I interrupted him with the kind of firm authority I'd never used with him before. "Stop talking!" The command was so unexpected that he actually did stop, his mouth remaining slightly open. "I've filed a police report for theft of inherited property," I continued. "I have bank records showing when you accessed my safety deposit box. I have documentation proving the ring belongs to me. I have recordings of you lying about your whereabouts during the theft." Derek's face was losing its practiced expressions, revealing something calculating and cold underneath. "You're bluffing. Even if what you're saying is true, it would be a civil matter, not criminal. Actually, it's a felony. The ring was appraised at $8,000, which makes it grand theft. Officer Martinez explained the charges when I filed the report yesterday." "You called the police?" Derek's voice cracked slightly. "I called the police," I confirmed. "I also called a lawyer, and I called the bank to get the security footage from your safety deposit box visit." Derek looked between Madison and me, his charming mask finally slipping completely. "This is insane. Even if there was some confusion about the ring's ownership, we can work this out." "Madison, you can't seriously believe—" "I believe my sister," Madison said firmly. "And I believe the documentation she showed me. And I believe my own eyes, Derek. That ring has a small chip on the setting from when Catherine knocked it against a counter last year, the same chip that's on the ring you gave me." Derek stared at Madison for a long moment, and I could see him realizing that his careful construction was completely collapsing. Madison wasn't confused or conflicted. She wasn't going to choose him over the evidence. She wasn't going to help him manage this crisis. When Derek looked back at me, his expression had transformed into something I'd never seen before: pure, undisguised anger. "You vindictive bitch," he said with quiet venom. "You can't stand that I chose someone better than you." The words should have hurt. 3 days ago they would have devastated me, but Derek had miscalculated again. He'd shown Madison exactly who he really was when his carefully constructed persona was threatened. Madison pulled the ring off her finger and held it out to me. "This belongs to you." I accepted the ring and slipped it onto my right hand, where it had lived for 2 years after my grandmother's death. "Thank you." Derek watched this exchange with growing desperation. "Madison, don't do this. Don't let her manipulate you like this. We love each other. We're building a life together." "Based on lies," Madison said simply. "Everything you told me about yourself, about the ring, about Catherine, about your previous relationship, it was all lies. I told you what you needed to hear to understand. You told me what you needed me to believe to get what you wanted." Madison's law school training was evident in her precision. "There's a difference." Derek's mask slipped further. "Fine, yes, I took the ring. But Catherine would never have let me propose with it, and you loved it, Madison. You said it was perfect. I was going to buy her a new one, something better." "With what money?" I asked. You've been unemployed since you started grad school. Derek's face flushed. I would have figured it out. Like you figured out how to steal from me to impress my sister? I didn't steal anything. Derek's voice was rising now, his control completely gone. That ring was just sitting in a safety deposit box doing nothing. You weren't even wearing it. Because you convinced me to put it there, I said calmly. Because you spent months pressuring me to remove it from my daily life so you could take it. Derek looked between us again, and I could see him searching for a different strategy, a new angle that might salvage something from this situation. Look, he said, his voice becoming reasonable again. Maybe I made some mistakes. Maybe I should have asked permission. But Madison and I have something real, something worth fighting for. Catherine, you've gotten your ring back. Can't we just move forward? It was classic Derek, the strategic retreat, the reasonable tone, the suggestion that everyone could win if we just stopped focusing on the ugly details of what he'd done. But I was done accommodating Derek's preferred narratives. You're going to be arrested, I told him. Tonight, actually. Officer Martinez is waiting for my call. Derek's face went white. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You committed a felony, Derek. You stole $8,000 worth of inherited jewelry through deception and fraud. You used that stolen property to manipulate an innocent person into a relationship based on lies. I pulled out my phone. The only question is whether you'd prefer to be arrested here, in front of Madison, or somewhere more private. Derek looked at Madison desperately. Madison, please, don't let her do this to us. Madison's voice was steady when she answered. There is no us anymore, Derek. The person I thought I was engaged to doesn't exist. But I love you. No, Madison interrupted. You love the idea of me. You love that I'm in law school, that I'm blonde, that my family already trusted you. You love that I was convenient and available and naive enough to believe your lies. She paused. You never loved me, Derek. You don't even know me. Derek stared at her for a moment, then turned back to me with undisguised hatred. This isn't over, Catherine. You think you've won something, but you've just guaranteed that no one will ever want you. Who's going to date someone vindictive enough to have their ex arrested? The threat was supposed to make me reconsider, to tap into my old insecurities about being alone, being unwanted, being too demanding. But Derek had revealed too much of his true character for his manipulation to work anymore. Someone who values honesty over charm, I said. Someone who understands the difference between love and possession. Someone who doesn't confuse my kindness with weakness. I dialed Officer Martinez's number. Derek was arrested 20 minutes later, charged with grand theft and fraud. Madison gave a statement as a witness, detailing the lies Derek had told her about the ring's history and origin. The police were professional and efficient, treating Derek with courtesy while making it clear that the charges were serious. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one final time. This won't make you happy, Catherine. Destroying my life won't fix whatever's wrong with you. I didn't respond. Derek still didn't understand that I wasn't trying to destroy his life. I was simply refusing to let him build his happiness on the foundation of my pain. The aftermath was complicated but ultimately liberating. Derek's arrest made the local news, and the story of the stolen engagement ring spread through our social circles with the speed that only truly dramatic gossip can achieve. Some people were sympathetic to Derek, suggesting that love made people do crazy things, that the charges were excessive for what was essentially a relationship dispute. But most people, once they understood the full scope of Derek's deception, were horrified by his calculating manipulation of both Madison and me. His MBA program placed him on academic probation pending the resolution of the criminal charges. His part-time internship terminated his employment immediately. Madison struggled with guilt and embarrassment for several weeks, convinced that she should have seen through Derek's lies sooner. I spent considerable time reassuring her that Derek was skilled at deception, that his manipulation techniques had been honed over years of practice, that she'd been a victim rather than a fool. Our family rallied around both of us with surprising unity. My parents were furious that Derek had exploited their trust and hospitality to execute his plan. My aunts and uncles, who'd all been charmed by Derek at various family gatherings, felt betrayed and used. Even my teenage cousins, who'd thought Derek was cool, were disgusted by his actions. The criminal case took 4 months to resolve. Derek eventually accepted a plea bargain that included restitution, community service, and probation. His lawyer argued for leniency, emphasizing Derek's previously clean record and his potential for rehabilitation. My lawyer argued that Derek's crime had been premeditated and sophisticated, requiring significant planning and deliberate deception. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd seen plenty of domestic manipulation cases, was unimpressed by Derek's apologies and promises of reform. She sentenced him to the maximum community service hours allowed under the plea agreement and ordered him to pay restitution not just for the ring's value, but for my legal fees and the costs of the investigation. More importantly to me, Derek was required to stay away from both Madison and me for the duration of his probation. He couldn't contact us, couldn't approach us at public events, couldn't use intermediaries to communicate with us. For the first time in 3 years, I knew that Derek couldn't manipulate his way back into my life. 6 months after Derek's arrest, I met James at a coffee shop near the university. James was a doctoral student in psychology, researching the intersection of emotional intelligence and ethical decision-making. He was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in my work with homeless teenagers. He asked questions about my experiences, my goals, my perspectives on social justice and community engagement. James had never heard of Derek, knew nothing about the ring drama, and had no preconceptions about my romantic history. He was interested in me as I actually was, not as a project to be improved or a prize to be won. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours. James was easy to talk to, quick to laugh, and completely comfortable with the parts of myself I'd learned to hide during my relationship with Derek. He didn't suggest that I was too serious about my work or too sentimental about my family connections. He didn't try to change my Friday night dinner traditions or my volunteer commitments. When I told him about my grandmother's ring, James asked to see it and listened carefully to the story of how she'd met my grandfather. He didn't suggest that it was old-fashioned or impractical. He didn't calculate its monetary value or wonder if it might be better replaced with something more modern. Instead, he said it was beautiful, that I was lucky to have such a tangible connection to my family's history, and that whoever I eventually married would be honored to know that Ring had chosen them rather than the other way around. It was exactly the response my grandmother would have hoped for from someone worthy of my loyalty. James and I have been together for 2 years now. He's met my family, integrated seamlessly into our traditions, and earned the kind of genuine affection that can't be faked or manipulated. When my parents talk about James, their warmth is unstudied and natural. When Madison talks about him, she mentions his kindness, his integrity, and the way he looks at me like I'm exactly the person he'd hoped to find. James hasn't proposed yet, and I'm in no hurry for him to. We've talked about marriage in the abstract, about the kind of partnership we both want to build, about the values we want to center in our shared life. But there's no pressure, no timeline, no sense that our relationship is incomplete without formal markers of commitment. When James does propose, if he chooses to use my grandmother's ring, it will be because we've both decided it represents the kind of love Eleanor and my grandfather shared, partnership based on mutual respect, honesty, and genuine affection rather than possession or control. If he chooses to propose with a different ring, that will be equally meaningful, a symbol of our own unique story rather than an inheritance of someone else's. What matters is that the choice will be ours together, made openly and honestly, without deception or manipulation or theft. Madison is also in a healthy relationship now, with a fellow law student named Rachel who treats her with consistent kindness and respect. Rachel knew about the Derek situation before they started dating seriously, having heard the story through mutual friends. She's never made Madison feel foolish or embarrassed about being deceived, instead expressing admiration for how Madison handled the situation once she learned the truth. Rachel is everything Derek pretended to be: intelligent, ambitious, genuinely interested in Madison's thoughts and goals, supportive of her family relationships, and completely honest about her own background and intentions. Madison occasionally receives updates about Derek through law school gossip networks. He finished his MBA program but struggled to find employment due to his criminal record. He eventually moved to another state, where he works for a small consulting firm that either doesn't know about his past or doesn't care about it. Madison feels no satisfaction in Derek's struggles, but she doesn't feel guilty about them either. Derek's problems are the natural consequences of his own choices, not the result of anyone else's vindictiveness or cruelty. Sometimes, when Madison and I are together at family gatherings, we talk about the lessons we learned from Derek's deception. About the difference between charm and character, between being impressive and being trustworthy. About how easy it is to rationalize red flags when someone is telling you what you want to hear. Most importantly, we've learned that being loving, generous, and trusting doesn't make us weak or naive, it makes us human. Derek's ability to exploit those qualities says nothing about their worth and everything about his character. The ring sits in my jewelry box most days now, waiting for the right moment to return to active duty. Sometimes I wear it on special occasions, family holidays, or when I want to feel connected to my grandmother's memory. It's no longer a symbol of broken promises or stolen dreams. It's simply what it always was, a beautiful piece of my family's history, waiting for the next chapter of its story. Derek thought he could steal my past to build his future. Instead, he taught me the difference between love and manipulation, between compromise and surrender, between being cherished and being owned. In the end, Derek gave me a gift more valuable than any ring: the knowledge that I deserve better than his version of love and the confidence to recognize the real thing when it comes along. The ring was always mine. Now, finally, so am I.